We are students of the art of play,
And we do this show called The Art of Play.
a show for the players who ask why.
My name's Vi.
And I'm Gaia.
So, Gaia, what is the art of play?
Well, do you mean the concept itself or about our particular show?
I think I understand the concept. So, the concept of the art of play is that the art is in the design of the show, in the gameplay, in the design, in the narrative. Why don't you tell me a little bit about this show?
Sure. So this show is going to be a weekly 1-hour podcast on game design, ranging from video games to board games to tabletop RPGs to pretty much anything else that encompasses the word play. And we're going to be focused on mechanics and narratives and how to make a good game, with the particular focus of ensuring that our viewers, our fans, our friends, and the people around us can talk about what makes a game good and what makes a game bad, with the language and even the education that developers can bring to the table.
We're giving people the tools to say, I like this game because.
Yes,
or,
exactly.
I didn't enjoy this game because.
Yeah, we want to make it so that when you talk about games, you have the vocabulary and the skills to really dig into it in a way that works for you and helps us make better games overall. As the more you can talk about it, the better games can be made from your reviews. So with that out of the way, we have an idea of what our show is. We are still left with a big hanging question in the air: who we are. So let me pass the mic back to you.
Okay.
Who are you? What is your job here?
Oh, I don't know about my job here, but my name's Vi. I guess we'll start there. I'm studying environmental and natural resources at UNB, and I'm on the UNB Woodsman team, which I know a lot of people don't know what that is, but it's...
Yeah, I don't think I know what that is, to be honest.
Okay, well, this might explain to you why I have a pocket full of sawdust today. It's a logging sports team, so we do a lot of chopping wood and sawing wood, but it's a sport. So
your sport is forestry.
my sport is forestry, but like traditional forestry, like
Right, okay.
early forestry. So my events, for example, are standing block chop, which is just sort of like felling a tree, sort of. So we set up a block, and then you take 2 chunks out of either side, and then it sort of mimics how a tree would fall. And then my other event is it's called Super Sweet, but it's with a bow saw, and I saw like 4 cookies very quickly.
Right,
Or
okay.
as fast as I physically can. Yeah.
As fast as you physically
As fast
can.
as I physically can without dying.
Nice,
Yeah.
nice.
Who are you?
Well, my name is Gaia. I am a student of far too many things
Yes.
at the same university, at University of New Brunswick in Canada. I study mathematics, physics, statistics, and computer science all at the same time. And no, I don't hate myself, but we're almost getting there. For me, my particular focus has been not on necessarily the more physical, outside kind of activities, but more so my academic side. I run a debate club at my university. I'm members of various councils. As a little fun fact about myself, I ran for election once, and that is an actual thing that happened.
Do you know that's actually where I knew you first from? Because I saw
You know,
stuff
a lot
on
of people
Facebook.
have come up to me and said that. Yeah, so I'm also a more avid game player, as you can imagine. I'm more of a video game kind of person. I have a library of too many games. My last count was over 450 games on Steam itself, and I've only played half of them.
That's a lot of games.
That's a lot of games.
That's a lot of
A lot of
games.
them came from Humble Bundle, to be honest, and I think that's true for most people. But I have a lot of games. I have a lot of hours in games. I'm counting at about 12,000 over the course of my life so far. Big in video games, but I know that your focus is a little bit different. So what's your focus coming into this?
I'm really into tabletop RPGs. Our history as friends is playing D&D together and then talking about D&D and talking, I think, too much about D&D sometimes.
Just maybe a
Just a
little.
little bit. That's Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah.
You know, the classic tabletop RPG. So, your tabletop role-playing games. I also really like Blades in the Dark, Wander Home, Sleep Away. Kids on Bikes is the next one I'm looking at playing. Like any
Kids
of
on Bikes?
Kids on Bikes
Kids
is
on
like
Bikes.
it's supposed to be like a Stranger Things inspired RPG. I'm very excited to play that
That's
one.
very cool,
Yeah.
actually.
Oh, Monster of the Week should fit in here. That was one of the first ones I played that wasn't D&D.
Okay,
Yeah.
so
Whoa.
all right, let's go into it. So now you have an idea of who we are as hosts. You know our interests, you know our areas of specialties, but you might notice something in particular listening to the show. We're not game developers. I myself studied computer science and was interested in game development for a few years, but never went very deep into it. And I think you yourself have not really studied game development as like a profession.
I've talked to friends about, trying to articulate why we like different games. My
Yes.
best friend, they don't really like Dungeons and Dragons. but they love Blades in the Dark. And those are very similar games
Right.
in how you play, in that somebody preps the game and then the rest of the players sit down and play through the game. Should we talk a little bit about how the show came to be?
I would love to talk about that. I know
Okay.
you have the story very well down. So let's hear it from let's let the viewers hear it now. Where does this show come from?
Well, it comes from our friendship, I think. So
I think so.
I hope so. So it comes from us talking about D&D and what makes D&D fun to play and mechanics that we liked and differences between different editions and what mechanics we liked there and what we didn't like there, and communicating about our players, because we both DM different games.
Yes.
About our players' play styles and how we were trying to incorporate that wasn't a word.
That was almost a word.
It was almost a word. How we incorporate how we incorporate. Thank you. Incorporate them into our planning.
Yeah, I think one of our early discussions was actually on a Discord call. I think was it 6 or 8 months ago now, where you and I just called to talk about how do you DM an effective game, coming as like a more from the player's background. And I think since then you've actually DM'd a couple of games and are part of how many D&D games are you part of right now?
Too many.
Too many.
I think half of my week evenings are D&D.
Yeah. So we have a lot of time talking about D&D together. Where did this show come from?
So we were in the cellar, which
cellar.
is the student pub, which is the perfect place for this to start.
Yeah, it's actually 2 floors down from
It
where we're
is.
recording this.
That's awesome. It's the same building.
It's the same building.
And we were having a discussion. I had just come back from work for the summer, and because I work up north, I'm basically MIA.
I think up north undersells how far north you were working.
I work near Dawson City
You do.
in the Yukon.
Yeah, you work in the Yukon,
I
Canada.
work in the Yukon,
You are
yes.
approaching the North Pole.
Yes. North of 60.
North of 60.
North of 60
oh my.
is
yeah.
it's very
cold.
far. Anyway, so I came back and we were like, "Oh, we should sit down and just, do a little catch up." And so we do this and our conversation drags the way it always does right into D&D.
I think I hadn't even sat down yet.
Yeah.
I came down to the cellar and you were there with one of my friends.
Yeah.
Just kind of chatting. And I didn't even know the friend was talking to you before then. They just messaged me like, "Hey, can I join in on the dinner?" And I was like, Ask the
Absolutely.
person who's organizing
Yeah.
it. That's not my decision. I come down. I haven't even sat down yet, and we're already bringing up D&D.
Yes. I think there's just some excitement about like coming back to school where you want to talk about the thing that you're excited about.
Oh yeah, of course.
Absolutely. So anyway, we start talking and we realize that we've got like a bit of flow. Like there's picking up pauses, like we've got some flow. And then I was
We also got a loud button clicking.
Okay. Well, we'll iron this out. But yeah, and then I got a message out of the blue that was like, "Hey, would you like to do a radio show with me?"
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
I was in class at the time. For those listening and who are curious, where I study mathematics, I was in a course titled Introduction to Differential Geometry, which no more information about that course is necessary. I'm about halfway through class, sitting at my computer like, I have a friend I can do a podcast with, and I want to do a podcast. So I just send you a message. You replied before I even closed Discord. I was still in class. You got immediately back to me about saying, yes, let's do it.
I saw a notification that said, "Do you want to do a podcast? And do you want to do a podcast about gaming?" And I like, oh, you know the meme that's like the hand hitting the button?
Yeah.
That was, that was me sending you a message that was just like, yes, I do want to do that.
And that was a hilarious moment for me, because I have to imagine, like, I did not see this from your side, but I'm just sitting, I can imagine you just sitting there and you just get this message, like this notification. Do you want to start a podcast? No questions asked, no other information. Yes. What's it about? That was your reply.
Yeah.
It was yes and, like you had practiced this question.
I'm
in
very
theater
good at
class.
improv. Yes,
You're-
and.
Yes and, but it also now gave you a multi-month commitment.
Yes.
Welcome.
Welcome to our once a week friend hang. our scheduled This is the thing that I love about D&D most. I'm sure I'll come back to this at some point, but it is genuinely just I have booked time to hang out with my friends because it's an excuse to hang out with your friends.
Of course.
That's what all of it tabletop gaming is.
That's even what this podcast turns into.
Yeah.
We've been here for about an hour now coming into this before really starting our recording. And we've just been talking about video games and the podcast itself and our life stories and what ailments we are facing in our life, both mentally and physically, although not much physically, to be honest. And that's still kind of the wonderful thing about podcasts. So we have an idea of where this podcast came from, and we know what it's about. But it's kind of hard to think about that on a conceptual basis. Everyone can listen to this and say, it's a podcast about game design.
Yes.
and then it stops there. So let's give an example of what's going on. I want to talk about some topics that will be coming up later. Talk about our favorite games, talk about things that we love within these games, mechanics and design decisions we love about them, and what about that decision made us like it. So I'm going to put this over to you first. Can you tell me one of your favorite games and talk a little bit about why?
I can give you my favorite game of all time is Breath of the Wild.
Ooh, who would have
And-
guessed?
Oh God, I never stopped talking about it. I would have known. And I have been trying for a really long time to put my finger on what I like about it. And of course, there's the narrative structure around discovery and exploring new spaces. And there's always something there. Like Breath of the Wild is that game that goes, there should be something behind that waterfall. So there is.
So there is.
So there is. But I think one of the things that makes it really good to play is that they set up all of the fighting mechanics and stuff like that right up front. They say this is how you fight and this is how you're always going to fight. And then everything that you add onto it is just sort of a buff to that system.
If I seem to recall, the game is designed so much around this concept that from the start of the game, you can go fight the final boss if you want. You're going to
absolutely.
die, but you can.
Yes.
You can do that.
There are people who have this game down to literally an art
Yes.
who will do that.
Yes, the speedrun category is launching a bomb on yourself to fling you into the castle and fight him within 10 seconds. Yes.
Yeah. Yes, that is exactly the thing. But I think the thing that I am most enamored by, the thing that does the good game mechanic thing where it sits quietly and you don't notice it until you notice it,
Right.
is the progression system of the game. So if I have a task to do, if I have I don't remember what they're actually called, a mission?
A quest?
A quest? Sure.
quest.
We'll call them a quest.
Let's call them quests.
If I have a quest to go do, I can select food to buff my sneakiness. I can select a weapon that will do something specific that is, if I'm going to fight an ice thing, I need a fire thing. Like those elements are very easy to understand
Yes.
and easy to implement.
Small
right?
decisions that you can make early on before going into something that it gives you advantages as you make your way through it.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the progression of it is better weapons, you get more health, you get some specific buffs that are sort of narratively like
Thematic?
yeah, they're thematic. They're from characters,
Yes.
right? So those things make that game very playable and very easy to understand. And I think that's one of the topics we go into. Is our first episode is depth versus complexity.
I think so. I think that is our first episode.
Would you like to talk a little bit about that so I don't drop it on our listeners without context?
I can talk about it a little bit. So I was going to go up next and say what my favorite game was. And you're lucky because my next game has exactly that concept in mind.
Okay.
I'm going to talk about the Civilization series.
Yeah.
Now, we've done lots of talking in the past. We've actually met up together to do some previous recordings as little test runs, and Civilization has come up every time. So for the listeners who have not heard of it, what is Civilization? Civilization is a turn-based hexagonal board game kind of video game.
It's like a beefed up Settlers of Catan.
It's a beefed up Settlers of Catan where you're building a civilization from the start of time to the end of time, starting around the agricultural revolution, ending with quite literally giant death robots. That's what they're called. There is no other information there. They're just giant death robots.
Wait, hang on. Is that how the game ends? There's
That is.
at some point giant death robots
No, you can
show
build
up?
them.
Oh, okay.
You can build them. You
Okay.
do make the giant death robots. They fight for you.
Interesting. I was imagining for a minute you hit some kind of deadline counter and these robots just descend and that's just the game makers going I don't know how to end this.
To be
die.
fair, if you turn on apocalypse mode, the game does end with a meteor strike that destroys civilization.
Oh, that's really entertaining.
That's not how the game is supposed to end, but that's an option. So in
Okay.
Civilization, you have a number of systems that you can work with. You have your science, which is obviously technological exploration, your culture, which is your building of your civics, your governmental styles, and your decisions throughout history. You have your faith, which is your religious beliefs and the religious structure that could benefit or harm your civilization. You have finances, which should not be surprising at all, resources you can build up, food and production, which are both aspects of your cities, as well as how happy your people are, and system upon system upon system upon system. Civilization is a very wide game in terms of systems. You have a lot of different things you can work on, a lot of different things you can do, but each of these systems is fleshed out wonderfully. When you're doing science, are you going to focus on naval technologies or military technologies or economic technologies? Do you want to build your faith or do you want to build your funds? These are all questions that you have to ask yourself. And even once you have the answer to these questions, you're still faced with what are you going to do with your culture? What are you going to do with every single other resource that you have? And then there's this wonderful little piece of, let's say you're building a religion in that game. You choose a belief that buffs your science. You use that science to unlock new buildings. You use those buildings to get yourself more culture. You use that culture to buff your religion. And you enter into this cycle of not only do you have this wide variety of systems, but you have these wonderful systems that work together with each other to make each other better. And this isn't even mentioning the fact that you can edit the map and that you can build on different tiles, and the fact that armies exist in this game as a way of projecting your power, or the fact that the religions in this game behave just like armies as well, and that you are fighting the other religions in conversion battles. It is a bit of a rudimentary way of saying it, but that's actually how it's formed. That this game has a lot of depth to it. And this is depth versus complexity at its heart. I think you and I have had how long was our discussion on it?
I think, honestly, we tried to keep it to an hour as like a...
I think so.
As just like a test episode, and then we continued to talk about it, so it ended up being like 3 hours of us just being like, this is really interesting, and here's other examples in other games. And
I think we went on a few tangents in there as well with other mechanics, but it was a lot
Yeah.
of just talking about depth versus complexity. And the heart of the matter is complexity is a measure of how many different things you have to think about. I just told you about a turn-based, board-styled strategy game. There is a lot that you have to think about. But on the other hand, these systems interact with each other in wonderful ways, and understanding any one system can make your life a whole lot better in this game, which is something that not every single game can say. So our first episode is going to be about this in greater detail. We're going to go into MMOs, Skyrim, numerous examples of D&D, and quite a lot more. But to bounce this back to you now, I know you have another game ready to talk about. Is that right?
Well, I do, but it's the big bad.
It's the big bad.
It's the big bad.
It's the big bad. Well, let's hear about it.
It's Dungeons and Dragons.
It's Dungeons and Dragons.
It's Dungeons and Dragons. I think we should sort of limit our discussion to 5th edition.
Should we limit to 5th edition?
Well, we can talk about other things, but I think 5th edition is where we're the most familiar with.
Yes. 5th edition is the one that we've both played, that we've both studied and learned on, that we've read online resources and homebrewed and run games with. The other editions are really good bases for identifying good game design ideas and bad game design ideas in reference to what we have available to us.
Well, and I think it's also really important that we look at the history of D&D in editions as not necessarily like bad game design decisions, but very different play styles, right? So the first edition is based on
D&D Basic, right?
D&D Basic, the
All right.
core rulebook, the blue box.
Is that what it's called? The blue box?
The blue box.
Oh, that's
I
wonderful.
think there was the blue box and the red box, but that's advanced.
Yeah,
Dungeons
red
and
would be
Dragons.
AD&D.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so let's hear about basic D&D.
So basic D&D was based on, I actually want to go a little bit before that even.
Okay.
So D&D has its heart in battle strategy gaming, in games that you would put on a table and you would play Civil War strategies. So basically simulations is what they are. And
Right,
that's
right.
where it has its heart. And then the creators of D&D were like, do you know what? We can take some of these rules and we can play something else that could be a little bit more fun, with everybody playing one character. So the image that I love most, and I'm afraid I don't know which creator of D&D was responsible for this whole thing. I really want to say Gary Gygax, but I can't say that with any certainty.
To be honest, I don't know the names in the slightest, so
Oh, okay. Well, if I can say
you can
that.
educate me.
Well, I would have to know for certain, and I don't. So I think it's Gary Gygax. We can run with that for a little bit. But regardless, basically, sitting behind a filing cabinet in his basement while his players worked through a very, very classic dungeon crawl. And in very early games, they had a caller. So it wasn't the DM in how we play now narrating things. It was one player speaking for the group, asking questions of Gary, who's just
Right.
in the corner sitting behind the filing cabinet. And then, asking questions like, oh, well, can I open this? How does this, I'm going to try to do this thing. And then building classes from there so that you could play different styles.
Right.
And
So
that's
kind
how
of
we
a
get
game
to-
and development style.
Absolutely. And they would put out these in Dungeon Magazine, they would put out little expansions and stuff. And then finally we need to put together a whole new rulebook system. And that's where 2nd edition comes from.
So that's where 2nd edition comes from.
So 2nd
AD&D.
edition AD&D, which is something that I have books for that I think we should put aside some time to actually try.
I think that'd be wonderful. That
Yeah.
might actually be wonderful to do on an episode if we have the time.
Oh, hey, a special
Maybe a quick
episode.
battle plus a little bit of gameplay.
Yeah. Yeah, that could be really fun. Maybe
be
some
really
character
fun.
creation. Okay,
Yeah.
I like
so what
it.
came after second edition then?
Second edition, we have third.
Okay, we're counting
Yeah,
up.
we're
That makes
counting up.
sense.
That makes sense.
It does get a little messed up here though.
It does, because we have fourth. Sort of.
But what came between third and fourth?
3.5.
There's 3.5 edition.
And 3.5 is a little funky. I know a little bit more about
It's the second most popular.
Yeah. And it's also, I think, where Pathfinder is based.
Pathfinder does come
Pathfinder's
from D&D
yeah.
3.5. So
So-
for our viewers who are curious, D&D 3rd edition was considered a bit of a black sheep in the family. It was considered to have a lot of flaws and a lot of game design decisions that were interesting, fascinating, and just needed more time to be worked out, more playtesting, which was hard to do at a time when your player base was still very, very small. So 3.5 edition was an attempt to take version 3, edition 3, and make a version that worked based on player feedback. It was really the developer saying, we hear you, and we're going to do this even better because you helped us. So let's go back into this now. We have an idea of what 3.5 edition, why it exists. So keep telling us about these various editions.
Well, and then we hit fourth,
Of course.
which for me is one of those ones where I think they went the wrong direction.
I agree.
And fifth is where they found their home again. Because
Which is where we are today.
which is where we are today.
For like the next few months.
Yes, and then we get a new one.
5.1,
5.1.
I think people have been calling it.
Yeah, that's funny actually. I love that we're going to get 3.5, 4, 5, 5.1.
We're turning our D&D editions into Windows updates.
Yeah, we really are. Yeah. And that's what it feels like too. So a lot of them now that they're getting like play tested and stuff. Now I just as a point of interest, I have Fizban's Treasury of Dragons, which is a
Ooh.
book that I wanted for a really long time.
It
And I
has
was
a wonderful name.
oh, so good. And I'm a sucker for dragons. So when I was like,
Oh, of
oh,
course.
book about dragon classes, I need that. And I think I sent you like some cool monk stuff because I just sort of built a character without
I think you did. I think I've actually incorporated that into a few of my monk builds.
Oh, awesome. So you sent me the thing that Wizards of the Coast put out for people to play test.
yes,
Before
some
they
UA
published the
content.
book.
Yeah.
So you gave me the UA content that I was then reading in the book that I had just been gifted.
Ah.
Yeah.
Was this when they had the different types of Dragonborn? So
Yeah.
there were gems and other forms. Okay,
yeah,
yes.
and then also where they were like starting to do some like monk subclasses and stuff like that. Yeah, like
okay, I see.
Way of the Dragon, I think is what that one's called.
I think so.
So that's sort of how D&D works now, is they put out some content and people play it and give feedback. And then that's what ends up in the book as part of the game.
And some of it is wonderful. I
Some
know
of it's
some of their
really cool.
playtest content for the Ranger, which I think is actually in your book now,
Yeah.
is the Drake Warden, a Ranger with
Yes.
a pet dragon.
Yes.
I think that made it into the book that
Someone
you have.
in one of my games is actually playing that.
My
class.
main D&D
Yeah.
character, who I actually use in video games as well,
Yeah.
is a Drake Warden Ranger.
There we go.
I use it with the revised Ranger, so it's a little powerful.
a little
but,
more valid. Yeah.
But
well,
it balances with
yes.
every average
we
paladin.
we just have issues with the Ranger class.
I think most players do. That's and they're not fixing it in 5.1.
Conceptually, I want the Ranger class to work, and then there's just mechanics that don't. That don't lend to that.
Let's pull this back to the topic of game design. We're talking about the
Yes.
big bad. We're now talking about the various forms of D&D. And as I think our viewers can tell, we care a lot about D&D. We care a lot about what it brings to the table and its impact that it's had in our lives. So with all of this said, tell me, what is a mechanic or a design decision or a narrative decision about D&D that really speaks to you?
That really speaks to me.
That really speaks to
It
you.
really speaks to me. Player agency is, I think, the obvious choice here. Is the ability a player has to step into this game and to do almost anything. And that's within the rules.
That's the point
is
of the game. That is D&D.
That is the game. But I think it's very powerful in that it lets you role play people that you aren't. It allows you to develop empathy. And that's really why I love D&D, but it's not really a mechanic. It's just sort of something that is at the heart of the game.
It's the core guiding principle of their design decisions. I'm certain you have some stories about this that you could tell us too, about this wonderful aspect of player agency that's maybe improved friendships or kind of defined moments that you still remember to this day.
definitely.
Do you think you
It's-
could tell us about some?
I can tell you broadly, I think.
Of course.
But I had a friend who we were having a really hard time communicating. I would get messages, after a game of D&D that were, I'm having a problem with your behavior, or just like, we have a problem. And then I would get paragraphs of it and I would be like, I didn't know this was a problem until you sent me a big long message about it. Which for me meant that that person was taking a step back and then thinking about it and thinking really long and hard and then writing something out to send to me, which meant that it was very, very important that it was discussed. But I was having a hard time receiving that in the way that it was. So through D&D, in having those issues and working through those issues, we now have a much stronger relationship. And I had a study date with them the other day, and they were like, oh, well, you know, if I have a problem, why don't I just text you? And I was like, no, because we don't communicate well like that. And those are just little things that I think are taken for granted.
So I'm going to offer a little bit of a lightning round of ideas of player agency that have come out of D&D that I think are wonderful. And let me start us off with my favorite little agency in D&D. I have a character in D&D who's a horse. They're not a centaur. They're a horse. They have no arms. They're a monk. Way of the Shadow Monk. Walk on walls, walk on water, teleport between shadows. Horse.
When this was pitched to me, I rolled my eyes so hard in the, like, if I was DMing it, I would love it. I would love it, but it was just like, it was such a Gaia choice in the best way. I was like,
wonderful.
Of course this is happening.
And of course I chose Way of the Shadow Monk because it means my kicks are extra powerful.
Yeah.
I can walk on walls, teleport between shadows, cast darkness as a spell, which is horrifying.
Which is horrifying. You're a horse that is a spider. And you can't be seen.
And I can't be seen.
Terrifying.
I have boost to stealth where horses should be, and debuffs to stealth where horses should not be. And that is the entire description of that ability. So that's one area
where horses should be. In a
field.
Course.
Okay.
In the town.
Player agency. Do you have a fun little short example of player agency in your games as well?
Oh, absolutely.
Hit me with one.
Okay. We, as a group, this is not a game that I DM, but we had an island that our DM had sort of kind of sent us to, but had guided our game that way. And my character had just come back from a break. And there is another character who is her ex-love interest, now sister's fiance.
That's a lot of words.
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 Keep going.
Anyway. And so those two characters, in the last episode that I played, I got punched out by that character. And there was like a whole fight and all of this role play stuff that happened that was so good. And it was the best session of D&D that I have ever played. And it was because we got to play with agency. So we knew each other's backstories, right? Because they were linked. And we knew that these two people were headed toward an argument. And we knew at some point that we were going to have to actually have this argument because there was no way around it. And once we get there, I realized I had in my head this like idea of how this little scenario was going to go down. I was like, I'm going to use this buff and I'm going to hit her like this and she's going to hit me with that and we're going to fight, right? But I had sort of forgotten that other players have agency at the table.
Yeah,
because,
your plans might not go exactly as you think.
And the wonderful thing about it was that our friends stepped in to try to stop the fight. And I didn't think that they would. I just, for whatever reason, I was like, no, like, we know they're going to fight and let the fight happen. And so we had to, actually think about other people's actions at the table. And they had to make choices, too, that were difficult in this emotional moment. So we get to this point where we're both being held back by other characters. And I turn around and say, no, I have this coming. Let her hit me. And then that opened up this like very emotional moment at the end of the fight where my character, who had been a little bit of an outcast, was officially sort of invited to the group because the characters chose to comfort her, to say, I've been where you are. Like, I'm sorry this is happening to you. And, here's the opportunity for you to come into the fold properly.
So you went in with a whole plan of what you wanted to see happen, what you wanted to do. And instead of that plan occurring, the other players made an emotionally charged, powerful moment. Now let me talk about a powerful moment.
A powerful
Maybe not
moment.
emotional,
Yes.
but powerful. So in D&D, there's this class called the Sorcerer, which is categorized by everyone's favorite subclass, the Wild Magic Sorcerer. And for our listeners who might not have played much D&D, their whole thing is the sorcerer can cast multiple spells, generally pretty adept at it, but usually through their own magical affluence and not actually their studies or a patron. They just became magical randomly, usually by dragon's blood. This one is by random chance. They've been blessed by nature. So their whole thing is when they cast spells, they don't have full control over it and it has a chance to go wrong. How wrong? Who knows? A chance to go wrong. And my player, they're in an arena,
It's
right?
almost like every time you cast magic, it's a roll of the dice.
Ooh, a little bit of a roll of the dice. So I had one player who was in an arena, and they were surrounded by some pretty chunky, pretty scary enemies. Okay, like they might have survived it, but with pain. And this player rolls a spell, very average spell. Roll their wild magic, it hits. Roll the table, see what effect they get. And they get an explosive fireball cast on themselves. And I didn't think it should just go off right as it is. Kill the players, ruin the fun. I told the player, you have 6 seconds, which is 1 round of combat. What do you do? I said, and I didn't give any other warning. I said, you feel a building pressure inside of you, a rising heat. You have 6 seconds. What do you do? It took a little bit to explain to that player, kind of let them clue in what was happening. They're having a bit of a day. Once they clued in, their immediate thought was, I rush the enemy, bear hug it, and blow up.
Yes.
And so they do that. They take out like 5 enemies in one hit. They go down,
Absolutely.
5 enemies go down with them. Absolute hero. They get revived by the players. They don't have like a revive spell. It's just they got down, so they got picked back up, basically. Wonderful moment for my players. Because my players were doomed at that point in time. I was the DM in this one. My players were doomed at that point in time. And the action of this one player who got an unlucky spell roll saved them.
Yes, and turning it into a lucky spell roll is the other thing that I'll say.
Of course. This
Right?
player had this agency within him to take a bad moment and make a decision to save the party.
Yes. I actually have another idea of player agency.
Let's hear it.
This is a quick example, but I play D&D with my family, which is just the nerdiest thing you'll ever hear me say.
Man, imagine your family not thinking D&D is a work of Satan.
I'm so sorry that that's your life. But so my dad played 2nd edition.
Of course.
That's why I have all of the books for 2nd edition.
That checks
Because-
out. That checks out.
Absolutely. He went to school in the, 80s and 90s, right? So his university group played 2nd edition.
Like the dawn of nerd
The
culture.
dawn of nerd culture. And he was an engineering student. So
so he was the nerd culture.
Yes, he was the nerd culture.
Okay, I'll shut up. Let's hear your topic. Let's hear
Okay,
your story.
excellent. So I had set up this situation where I had a Oath of Vengeance paladin, and she was an NPC. And I'm trying to convince my dad that paladins are actually a really good class now because they're super overpowered, because he remembers them in 2nd edition as being sort of like knights
One
in shining
mistake and
armor.
you're out.
Yeah, exactly. Just sort of annoying characters. So I had this character that I was trying to say, like, she's a paladin and she's super cool. I love her.
Super cool
Super
paladin.
Cool. And there's a creature called a revenant, which is basically just like a super powerful ghost that comes to kill one specific person. And then we were sort of playing a Witcher inspired game. So there was a Witcher gathering. Like, everybody came back, and so there were all of these Witchers here, and we had a tournament, and we did like a festival, and that was all cool, which got interrupted by this huge big bad ghost thing. And my family goes, oh, well, what's going on there? Like, let's go figure it out. Because it possesses one of the Witchers and like makes them fight somebody. So they're trying to sort of solve this mystery to figure out what's happening. And so they go talk to this paladin, and she's like, it's going to come back to get me tonight. I know that. And so they have this space of time where they can plan something before the Revenant comes back. And so I'm like, here's your setting. What do you do? My dad looks at me, and I wish I had clocked this sooner. But he looks at me and he raises his eyebrows and he's like, so we're at a festival with a bunch of super powerful, like, people, right? Bunch of monster fighters. And I go, yes. And he's like, great. I'm going to go into the field and just see how many of them I can get to help us. And I hadn't even thought that they would do that, right?
In an environment of monster hunters,
Yes.
a monster appears. And
Yes.
you didn't think they would hunt the monster.
Well, I had sort of set them up as like outcasts of that sect.
Ah.
And so just didn't even think about it. But to my credit, this was over Christmas. and I had probably an hour to prep the game.
I take an
So-
hour to prep most of my games, and it is
Whoa.
pure suffering. It is
Yes.
actually it's 2 hours pure panic.
Yes.
Okay, continue.
Anyway, so my dad goes, "Okay, how many people do I get to help?" And I'm like, "Roll charisma, I guess." And then I have him roll at disadvantage because I'm like, well, most of them are drinking, and some of them
Also,
have
they're
left.
witchers.
Also, they're witchers.
They're not exactly the best at social interaction.
They're also not like jump up and help you at the first chance you get. Like they're also that's dangerous,
Yeah.
right? So I'm
They,
like,
they do only work for pay, but
Yes.
always work for pay.
but I'm looking at this situation where I have this player agency that I love. I'm like, oh yes, of course you can use the people around you. But then I'm looking at a mechanic. Like, how do I resolve that? How do I go? You go stand in a field and shout for a little bit. Like, I guess roll charisma. I guess use this mechanic.
Right.
And we'll use this other alternate rule, which is roll at disadvantage because I don't. You're gonna break my game if you roll a 20 right now. So, yeah. And then they brought them back and killed the beastie.
Even getting one of those people would
Yes.
fundamentally change the game, the plan.
Yes.
But it made a better experience for you and for the players.
absolutely.
Their quick thinking on their feet was wonderful. And we could obviously juxtapose this with every single story of giving a kindergarten-style puzzle to your players and them not
Yes.
being able to solve it.
The amount of times players have been foiled by doors comes to mind.
Oh. Or the amount of times my players burst a hole through the wall because they don't know how to open the door. So we have an idea of the beauty of player agency that we've experienced in D&D. I'd like to go a little bit to another side of things with D&D, and I'd like to talk about asymmetrical play. So a big concept in game design is the idea that not every player is going to be equal in your games, that there's going to be players who are going to be different. They have different abilities, different advantages and disadvantages. Many people think of the game CSGO when they hear this. They think about the counter team and the T team, which I don't think I'm allowed to say on air if you know what that stands for, where the goal of the counter team is simply to defeat the T team, but the goal of the T team is to plant a bomb in a hidden location that the counter team has no clue about, and that bomb just has to go off. All the members can die, but if the counter team can't find the bomb, the T team still wins despite having lost the fight. And that's the asymmetrical gameplay. They have two separate goals. D&D is perfect for this. In D&D, you have two, I don't even want to say groups. It's one person and then a team.
Yes.
Where this one person is the game. They build the world. They build the characters. They voice every character. They build the backstory. They build the encounters. They play the encounters. They determine the consequences. They determine the gameplay. They are the game.
Yes, your dungeon master does a lot of planning before they even sit down at the table. They do a
course.
lot of playing of just sort of, theater of the mind, if you will, to sort of guess at what might happen at the table when they sit down.
But you can never know because the player agency. And then you have the players themselves. They don't need to plan the game. They don't need to know the backstory. But they need to be intimately familiar on an incredibly personal degree with their character. This one person, their backstory, their history, their beliefs, their personality, their desires and wishes. The DM needs to know very little information about any one NPC, but they need to know a lot of NPCs. You as a player only need one character, and maybe the things you memorize to help your character, but that one character needs to be perfect.
And you have to be very good at playing to your character.
Yes.
And I mean that if you're playing a character with low intelligence, you probably don't get to solve the puzzle. And not in the way that maybe a wizard would.
Yeah.
You get to trip over the rock that the key is under and fall across the floor.
Yeah.
And maybe as a player, you just solved the puzzle because you figured it out.
Mm-hmm.
But
your
going
character
to
didn't.
Your character didn't. So you can play your character as accidentally doing
Or
something.
as a barbarian, if there's a trap, like one of those swinging doors that hits you with spikes, a barbarian can grab it and just stop it from swinging if they have enough strength. That's a solution to a trap that they didn't expect. All they need is good reaction times and a high strength roll. And this asymmetrical play, the fact that you have one player playing so differently than everyone else, makes the game D&D. That's where D&D comes from. It's the beauty of the game.
I almost hesitate to call the DM a player.
But the DM is a human being playing the game as well. And yeah, player's not the right word, but yet they're playing a game. And you always ask the question, how do you win as the DM? You win as the DM by having fun. with the players by making an enjoyable experience that's not just for you, but for everyone else. And there are tutorials upon tutorials upon tutorials online about how to do that effectively. It's hard.
There's books about it.
There's full books about how to be a good DM and how to create this asymmetrical gameplay in a way that you can enjoy and others can enjoy.
There will probably be a podcast episode about it on this show.
There will probably be a podcast episode about it on this show. Tune in to find that one out. But the asymmetrical play is what makes D&D fun. I am willing to bet that a game that's just a bunch of players, which can be really fun, lacks that element and needs to make up for it in another way, or else it will be less enjoyable in some ways, but also less risky. And I can see you with your finger up, so let's hear it.
I will juxtapose D&D because I'm the tabletop RPG person at
You
this
are
table.
the expert at this
Absolutely.
table.
I will juxtapose D&D with a game that is more focused on improvised narrative than sort of your traditional sort of battle strategy of D&D, with a game like Wanderhome, where there isn't a DM.
Not one at all.
There is not a player at the table who knows where that game is going to go. Now, there are optional rules where you sort of can play with a guide if you don't want to do that.
Mm-hmm.
But the games that have gone the best, that have been the most fun, are the ones where we don't have a guide. Where we sit down and we go, I don't know what we should do next. And we just do what feels good to do next. And those games are fundamentally very different.
They're very different, but they have to play upon different aspects of the players to make them enjoyable. And D&D can be enjoyable with its asymmetrical gameplay that makes it unique. Now, we've talked a lot about D&D here. We've gone into a lot of details of the wonderful various aspects of it, but we have people listening from many angles. And I'd like to pull us back to one more discussion, a kind of the final point of this episode to give people a taste of what we're like. I want to talk about narrative. I want to talk about writing a story rather than just building a game in design. Many games are built around their story, and the idea of the story is fundamental to its enjoyment. Most D&D games are like this. You can hear many stories about people being bored out of their minds of the slow combat, wanting to get to roleplay. And many video games are too. I'd point to Final Fantasy, Kingdom Hearts, or my favorite, which we'll go into now, Undertale.
I will point out that before I was into video games, the things that people would say to me to try to bring me into video games was, oh, but the story is so good. Like, you should play the game because you want to get through the story. And I never understood that until I picked up gaming again later.
Yeah, and it can be very difficult because story is not just what you say. It's not just the discussions between players or the events happening. It's so much more than that. So for those who are listening and have not played Undertale, a game made by Toby Fox, who, by the way, is a musician in real life. It is a game made by a musician. It's a game where you play as a kid that has fallen into basically a mountain. The reason why we don't know, but it turns out he falls into the center of the mountain where they're encountered with monsters who were sealed away generations ago and forgotten about. And their whole idea is making their way through this land of monsters without dying because the monsters want their soul to break the magic barrier, right? They need one more human soul. They need 7. They've gotten 6 from 6 other humans that have fallen down, and you want to make it out. And the weird thing about this game is it styles itself as a game where you don't have to kill anybody. It's a game that you can play as a pacifist and make it through and win, actually have a victory. Now, I'm not going to spoil this victory. What I want to talk about, the beauty of this game, is multi-purpose, multi-built story design. Because Undertale's not just a game where you hear the story. Actually, I would struggle to tell you the backstory of Undertale beyond what I've just told you. But Undertale has various characters who are all known for many different things. The first character you meet is named Toriel. She's the tutorial. That's the joke. Start and stop.
Yes.
But her whole thing is that she is a mom who is left to the Monster Society because she was once the queen. And she left the Monster Society because she didn't feel at home there. And she wants to protect humans who fall down to not have their souls taken. And she spends her time overprotecting you. You then run into Sans, a skeleton who's all about puns and jokes, and his brother, who absolutely hates the jokes, but is obsessed with capturing a human while being very incompetent at it. You run into the chief of the guard and a scientist and many others of these wonderful characters. But not only that, you run into music, which can be storytelling. Many of the songs in the game are remixed versions of previous songs, either sped up or slowed down. They sound unique, but once you clue in, you get these connections you didn't have before. There's many world-building decisions. All the assets, all the different backgrounds in the game determine the story. You go into Papyrus's room at one point in the game, and it is a perfectly ordered but incredibly prideful room full of tributes to himself. And Sans' room has a literal tornado full of socks.
Okay.
That's actually a thing. It takes a while to get there, but that's a real thing. Sock
Okay.
tornado. And it's this wonderful piece of storytelling through various aspects. Even the fights in the game, the way that they attack you, and if they hesitate on their attacks, tells you about their characters. And it's something that I find wonderful in games like Undertale. And I'm certain you have your ideas of telling a story not just through the narrative, but through
Yes,
multiple other
not
pieces.
through what you're delivered.
Yeah.
I love environmental storytelling, and I know that's one of the things that, we'll probably talk about a lot later. But the idea that you can find something without knowing what it is, without knowing the story that got you there first. And that's something that I would like to see more of in my personal D&D games, is to set up a situation and just go, you don't know what happened here, but you can figure it out through what's here. The game that comes to mind for me for this is a game called Unpacking.
Ooh, I've heard about it.
Okay,
Tell me.
you need to play this. So this game sort of follows a person through their life, through when you move into a new place. And you learn about this person and the things that they're going through just by unpacking their things. And every time you meet a new level, and it's basically just, the game is, I take it out of the box and I put it in a cupboard. Oh, that picture should be hung here. These clothes should go in that cupboard. And it's just sort of, it's a point and click, basically.
Basically, yeah.
Yeah. And it's a story. But it's told in this way that is delivered so carefully through the environment and through the things that you interact with, none of which are people in dialogue, all of which are the items of this person's life. And
yet you know so much about
much
the person.
And I'll point to one example. The other example I have spoils the game, and I think it's a wonderful discovery of the game. It's a really beautiful reveal. So please play Unpacking, but I'll give you this. There is these little collectible statuettes, I guess I'll call them, little knickknacks that this person collects. And the first time you encounter them is pulling them out of the same box. And then it sort of occurs to you that you should put them on the windowsill. And they are landmarks of places. So they are the Leaning Tower of Pisa. I think there's a London bus and that sort of thing. And as you get further through the game, there are a few more of them, which just tells you that this person has been able to travel more, which is beautiful and wonderful. And then you find other things that are like that in this environment.
Which is a wonderful way of telling a story without necessarily telling the story. I'd like to pull back to Undertale for one more thing as kind of our final example this episode before we close out. In Undertale, I mentioned Toriel, who used to be the queen. Now that's a little bit of detail, it's a little spoilery, but it's perfectly fine for you to know going into the game. And she has a song, not too much matters about it. Her house also has a song that is key to like the background. It's this peaceful kind of played on like an ocarina type music. You make it to the end of the game. You're in the final house before you meet the king. And the same song plays.
Ooh.
Exactly the same.
Huh.
It's called New Home, and it's
Okay.
a beautiful song. And you make it to fight the king. And parts of his song are the same as parts of the queen's song.
Ooh.
It's not the entire thing, but just these little motifs that appear and then disappear quickly.
This studio is so hot, and I just got shivers.
Same.
Like-
It's a beautiful event in the game that tells you something important about storytelling. The game will later on tell it to you much more directly, but the first time that hit me, I nearly cried. Because it's
Yeah.
a beautiful moment, a feeling of loss. And there's one key difference between their houses. Toriel's house is bright, it's vibrant, colorful, full of design, full of all these different features that make it her home. The king's home is gray. It's the same design, but it misses all these little details, all these personal things. It's like someone just built it and they're still moving in, and nothing has color except for one yellow flower. It's a beautiful moment of storytelling when you meet the king.
Yeah.
And the king has a garden of these flowers that he's watering. And he refuses to fight you until he finishes watering them for
Yeah.
a moment. And it's a beautiful piece of storytelling that tells you a lot more about these characters without them saying anything, except for him saying that he refuses to fight you.
Yes.
And that's a beautiful way of telling a story. So we've kind of gotten into a lot of topics here today. We've gotten into a lot of different things. I'm kind of feeling the weight of that little last
Yeah.
bit of Undertale on top of me now, which is, ooh, it's weighing me down trying to go into this like high energy outro.
Well, maybe I can pick up for you.
Let's hear it.
So we've done an introduction about who we are and who we are. This is the art of play.
This is the art of play.
And what we're going to talk about, which is design, is
How to build a
gameplay,
game.
narrative, what makes games good, what makes games worth
Sad.
looking at.
What makes them emotional?
What makes them worth sharing with your friends? Because I think at the end of the day, when I encounter a good game, the first thing that I do with it is I tell my friends that they should play it.
You share it with others.
Right? So I want to give people tools to communicate good games and why their friends should play it. And even discuss, hey, why is that your favorite game versus I didn't like it very much.
Yeah.
Let's
and we
give
have
some
the
tools to talk about that.
to go into it.
Absolutely.
So this has been The Art of Play. In today's episode, we talked about many of our favorite games. We talked about a few game design concepts that we're going to be coming back to. We talked about depth versus complexity, the idea of thinking versus what you get back from it. We talked about various forms of storytelling. We talked about player agency in many of your stories with D&D, right? We've talked about many different game design concepts. And what are we talking about next episode? Let's see if our players, our listeners, can remember. But you tell me, what are we talking about next time?
We're talking about depth versus complexity.
We're going back into the strategy discussion. We're going to go into the D&D discussion. And we're going to talk about how much thinking you have to do versus how much reward you get for that thinking. So tune in next time to hear about all that we have to say about depth versus complexity and our various other topics as we go through this series talking about game design, why it's good, and how you can talk about it better and make better games. So I've been Gaia.
I've been Vi.
And thank you for listening. Have a wonderful time. We'll see you next week. Okay.
Okay.
One more time?
One more time.